History teachers love a good lie, especially when it comes with a map and a chalkboard. We spent years memorizing myths that would make a drunk time traveler blush. Turns out, the truth about history is less noble heroes and more collective oopsie. And we've only scratched the surface, because the next few centuries of nonsense are even worse. 1. Remember learning that Napoleon was a tiny little man who compensated for his height with world domination? Yeah, that's pure propaganda, courtesy of the British, the original kings of trash talk. Napoleon was about 5'6" in modern measurements, perfectly average for his time. The confusion came from a French to English conversion error and a few centuries of British comedians who couldn't resist the short jokes. So, while the man conquered most of Europe, history decided to roast him for being travel size. Imagine leading empires and still being remembered as the human equivalent of a step stool. 2. Let's talk about Vikings and their imaginary horned helmets, because somewhere along the line, history swapped reality for a heavy metal album cover. Actual Viking helmets were practical and sleek, designed for, not getting stabbed in the head. The horned look came from a 19th century opera costume designer who thought, more horns, Bosque, more drama. The myth stuck faster than duct tape on a boat. So thanks to one overzealous costume guy, every Halloween party since 1876 has looked like a buffalo convention instead of a raid. 3. And then there's the classic, medieval people thought the earth was flat. Spoiler, they didn't. By the Middle Ages, almost everyone with access to a church, book, or eyeballs knew the planet was round. Even sailors noticed ships disappeared hull first over the horizon. The whole flat earth thing was a 19th century myth invented to make medieval folks look dumb and modern people feel smart. It's basically the historical equivalent of a Reddit argument, loud, wrong, and fueled by smugness. 4. You've probably heard the story of George Washington's wooden teeth. A fun little fact teachers love tossing in like it's proof the founding fathers were part lumberjack. Except none of it's true. Washington's dentures were made from ivory, gold, lead, and even bits of donkey and cow teeth. Basically, he was walking around with a mouth full of Noah's Ark. The wood rumor came from the stained ivory darkening over time, giving it a grainy look. So no, America's first president didn't smile like a treehouse. But he did prove that good dental care and democracy both had a rough start. 5. And speaking of facts we were force-fed, no, witches in Salem weren't burned at the stake. They were hanged, which somehow feels like history's idea of a technical correction. The burning part came from European witch trials, but America, ever the overachiever, decided to do executions its own. Underway. One poor guy, Giles Corey, was even crushed under stones for refusing to plead guilty. The myth of burning witches is a nice dramatic image. Fire, pitchforks, chaos. But the truth is just bureaucratic murder with worse paperwork. 6. Let's talk about the Einstein failed math myth, the most abused motivational quote in human history. Every time a student bombs algebra, a teacher whispers, "Even Einstein failed math once." He didn't. Not even close. By age 12, he was acing calculus like it was Sudoku. The misunderstanding came from a reversed Swiss grading system, where 1 was the best and 6 was the worst. Someone saw his report card, got confused, and the myth spread faster than bad TikTok science. Einstein didn't fail math. Humanity just failed reading comprehension. 7. Ever been told that medieval people never bathed? That's another myth invented by 19th century historians trying to make their ancestors sound cleaner by comparison. Medieval Europeans actually loved bathing. Public bathhouses were social hubs, complete with snacks, drinks, and occasional bad decisions. Even monks had wash schedules. What ruined it all? The bubonic plague and church paranoia about immoral cleanliness. So next time someone says people back then were filthy, remind them that medieval folks bathed more often than a 2020s gamer in a 3-day Fortnite binge. 8. And then there's the myth of Columbus bravely proving the Earth was round while everyone else thought he'd fall off the edge. Wrong again. Everyone already knew it was round. They just had better math. Columbus underestimated Earth's size by, about half a planet. He thought he'd reach Asia in a few weeks and accidentally discovered an entire continent instead. It's like setting out for Taco Bell and ending up founding a new country. So yeah, he didn't prove the Earth is round. He just got very lost and very lucky. 9. Here's one that deserves its own apology letter. The myth that medieval doctors used leeches for everything. While it's true they did love a good leech, they weren't idiots. They actually had a surprisingly complex understanding of medicine for their time. The problem? Hollywood got involved. Filmmakers needed a quick, gross equals old-timey visual, and boom, leeches became the mascot of medieval stupidity. In reality, doctors used herbs, surgery, and even anesthetics made from opium and wine. The leech thing was just their version of essential oils, except with a higher chance of success. 10. Speaking of facts that got mangled in translation, Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian. That's right, Egypt's most famous queen was Greek. She descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who set up shop in Egypt after the empire fell apart. Cleopatra was born in Alexandria, spoke multiple languages, and probably rolled her eyes at tourists trying to pronounce Sphinx. The myth stuck because Hollywood needed her to look exotic and mysterious, for casting reasons. So yes, she ruled Egypt, but genetically, she was more Athens than Nile. 11. Here's another myth that deserves detention. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." It's one of history's most famous quotes that she absolutely didn't utter. The phrase actually existed decades before she was even born, used by philosophers mocking royal ignorance. But when France needed a scapegoat, they pinned it on the fancy lady with good hair. Marie's real crime? Terrible timing. She was an easy symbol for privilege right before a revolution, and history loves a convenient villain with a catchy soundbite. 12. You were probably told the Great Wall of China is visible from space. Spoiler, it's not. Not with the naked eye anyway. Astronauts say you can see cities, airports, and highways, but the wall just blends into the landscape like a really long sidewalk. The myth came from a 1930s newspaper article that got repeated until it became fact. So while the wall might not be visible from orbit, the embarrassment of every teacher who taught this still echoes through the cosmos. 13. Next up, the Trojan horse, one of the oldest definitely happened stories that definitely didn't. Archaeologists have found no evidence of a giant wooden horse. It's more likely a metaphor. Horse was ancient slang for a siege engine. So instead of a bunch of Greeks hiding inside a wooden pony, it was probably a battering ram. But try telling that to 3,000 years of artists who really liked the idea of sneaky carpentry. Humanity just collectively agreed, yeah, a giant horse makes more sense than a door-bashing machine. 14. Let's not forget about Vikings again, because the myth that they never reached America is also wrong. About 500 years before Columbus, Norse explorers made it all the way to Newfoundland, Canada. They built temporary settlements, traded with locals, and left behind enough archaeological evidence to make every textbook from the 1950s look awkward. But of course, that didn't fit the whole Columbus was first narrative. Turns out, history isn't written by the victors. It's written by whoever had better PR. 15. You might have heard that medieval knights couldn't move in their armor, like they were tin cans falling over in slow motion. In reality, a properly fitted suit of plate armor was so well balanced, knights could run, jump, even do cartwheels in it. There's footage of reenactors proving it, which means your history teacher made you picture a clunky robot when medieval soldiers were basically CrossFit champions in steel. The myth came from centuries of bad museum mannequins that made armor look heavier than it really was. 16. Finally, let's talk about the myth that the Library of Alexandria burned down in one tragic night. It didn't. It actually declined over centuries, burned, rebuilt, neglected, and finally erased by politics more than fire. The single catastrophe story is just tidier for textbooks. The truth? It's a bureaucratic slow-motion disaster, ancient paperwork, empire drama, and apathy. Basically, the library didn't explode, it just got ghosted by history. A fitting metaphor for every great idea humanity's ever lost because someone forgot to pay the fire insurance. 17. Let's tackle the myth that medieval maps showed sea monsters because people genuinely thought they existed. Nope, they weren't warning signs, they were illustrations. Medieval cartographers were basically the Pinterest artists of geography. They filled blank spaces with dragons, mermaids, and krakens because uncharted looked boring. It wasn't ignorance, it was branding. Here Be Dragons was the Middle Ages equivalent of this area under construction. But centuries later, historians decided it meant sailors genuinely feared being eaten by fish with bad tempers. Reality check, they feared pirates and scurvy way more. 18. You know the story about Nero playing the fiddle while Rome burned? Classic villain energy, except it's completely false. For starters, fiddles didn't even exist yet. Nero was actually out of town when the fire started and came back to coordinate relief efforts. Ancient historians who hated him spun the fiddle story as early political smear propaganda. The man wasn't a saint, but he also wasn't a pyromaniac violinist. The myth just proves that fake news didn't start with Twitter. It started with bored Roman senators and a solid sense of drama. 19. Ever heard that medieval peasants all died before age 30? Not quite. That life expectancy stat is brutally misleading. It's dragged down by sky-high infant mortality. If you survive childhood, you could easily live into your 50s or 60s. Medieval villages weren't packed with 30-year-old grandmas. They were full of hardworking adults with bad backs and better immune systems than we give them credit for. Basically, life expectancy wasn't about dying young. It was about babies statistically ruining the curve. 20. Then there's the myth that the pyramids were built by slaves. Hollywood loves the image, sunburned peasants dragging blocks under whips. But the truth is far less dramatic and way more bureaucratic. Archaeological evidence shows the workers were skilled laborers, fed well, given housing, and even got medical care. They weren't slaves. They were government contractors with dental plans. Ancient Egypt was basically running the world's first construction union. So next time someone says slaves built the pyramids, just remind them it was more like tax-funded professionals with great calf muscles. 21. Here's one for your childhood trauma. People didn't actually think tomatoes were poisonous because of the tomato itself. It was the plates. Wealthy Europeans used pewter dishes high in lead content. Acidic foods like tomatoes leached the lead, causing illness and death. So they blamed the fruit instead of their heavy metal tableware. Imagine centuries of culinary exile because nobody thought to switch plates. The tomato wasn't deadly. Dinnerware was. Humanity. 0. Chemistry. 1. 22. Let's address another classroom classic. Isaac Newton discovered gravity when an apple hit him on the head. No, he didn't need a fruit-based concussion to understand physics. The apple story was a later embellishment by his biographer, trying to make math sound exciting. In reality, Newton just watched an apple fall and started wondering why objects always drop straight down. But apparently, quiet thinking doesn't sell as well as slapstick science. So history gave us Eureka, when the truth was more like, interesting. 23. You've probably heard that medieval Europe thought the Earth was the center of the universe, and everyone just went along with it until Galileo showed up. Wrong again. Astronomers had debated heliocentrism since ancient Greece. It wasn't ignorance, it was a math problem. Galileo's real sin wasn't saying the Earth moved, it was saying it moved in a way that made the church look wrong in public. Basically, he got canceled for bad PR. Science didn't suddenly appear in the Renaissance. It just started publishing louder. 24. And finally, the myth that knights rescued damsels in distress every other Tuesday. Real knights weren't noble heartthrobs. They were heavily armed landlords with anger issues. The whole chivalry thing was medieval PR to make violent men seem dateable. Honor meant not stabbing other nobles, not saving random peasants. Most knights spent their days managing farms and intimidating tenants, not galloping to rescue maidens from dragons. The damsel in distress myth was invented by poets, not eyewitnesses. It's the Middle Ages version of an Instagram filter, polishing up the bloodstains for romance points. 25. Let's start this round with a royal whopper. People love saying Queen Elizabeth I was the Virgin Queen. Sure, she never married, but virgin was more of a political slogan than a purity badge. Her image as an untouchable goddess helped her keep power in a world where a husband meant losing authority. Basically, she rebranded single life into statecraft. The myth stuck because men writing the history books couldn't wrap their heads around a woman choosing power over marriage. It's not chastity, it's strategy with good PR. 26. Ever heard the story that Vikings drank from the skulls of their enemies? Yeah, that was just 18th century mistranslation cosplay. The Norse term Orbjugvidum Hausa actually meant from curved branches of skulls, poetic talk for drinking horns. But some imaginative translator decided it was literal skulls, and history went, sure, sounds metal. So centuries of artists and death metal bands have been inspired by what was basically a really bad Google Translate moment. 27. Then there's Paul Revere, the lone hero shouting, "The British are coming," across colonial America. Except that never happened. For starters, everyone in the colonies still considered themselves British at the time. Revere was one of several riders, and what he actually said was closer to, "The regulars are out." He got captured halfway through the mission, and another guy finished it. The myth was written later by a poet who decided the story needed more cinematic flair. History didn't ride on one man's midnight heroism. It rode on a team effort that got rebranded for patriotism points. 28. Now, the myth that the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th. Sorry, fireworks lovers. But nope. The document was approved on that date. It wasn't actually signed until August 2nd. July 4th became the holiday because it sounded better. Independence in August just doesn't have the same fireworks energy. So when you celebrate with burgers and beer, remember, you're toasting a paperwork approval date, not the moment of rebellion. America's independence was literally an exercise in creative scheduling. 29. One of my favorite myths. Einstein invented the atomic bomb. Nope. He didn't even work on the Manhattan Project. His only involvement was signing a letter warning the US government that Germany might be developing nuclear weapons. Einstein was a pacifist. The idea of building one horrified him. But his fame made him an easy scapegoat for science gone wrong. So now, in pop culture, the kindest theoretical physicist ever gets mistaken for Dr. Doom. 30. Let's bust the myth that Roman gladiators always fought to the death. While it makes great cinema, it was terrible business. Training gladiators was expensive. Killing them every weekend would have bankrupted the organizers. Most fights ended when one fighter was wounded or yielded. Death matches happened, sure, but they were the UFC's pay-per-view special events. Gladiators were entertainers and investments, not disposable action figures. So, if you're picturing a coliseum dripping with blood, adjust your expectations. It was more like ancient reality TV with a higher risk of decapitation. 31. Here's a classic bit of misinformation. Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity by flying a kite in a thunderstorm. No, he wasn't conducting science while dodging lightning bolts like Thor on Casual Friday. He did fly a kite, but during a mild storm, not an electric apocalypse. And his experiment wasn't to discover electricity, but to prove lightning was electricity. Still, it's a miracle he didn't get electrocuted, because 18th century safety standards were basically try it and hope for the best. The man risked death so future teachers could oversimplify it for fourth graders. 32. And finally, for this batch, people say medieval Europeans thought cats were evil, and that's why rats spread the plague. The truth's much darker. They did start killing cats after the church declared them symbols of witchcraft. Ironically, that superstition wiped out the best natural defense against plague-carrying rats. So yes, they feared witches, burned cats, and accidentally supercharged a pandemic. It's the historical equivalent of deleting your antivirus software because it looked suspicious. The moral, fear-driven stupidity has a long, proud tradition, and it always ends with fleas. 33. Let's begin this round with a myth that's pure cinematic nonsense. Knights raising their visors as a sign of respect. Cute idea. Total fiction. The gesture didn't mean chivalry, it meant visibility. You lifted your visor so you could see and breathe, not to politely nod before stabbing someone. The respectful salute interpretation was added centuries later by romantic painters who couldn't stand the thought of medieval warfare being sweaty, chaotic, and full of grunting. Real knights weren't graceful. They were armored tanks yelling, "Where's my sword?" under 10 pounds of metal. 34. Here's one that haunts every school art poster. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel flat on his back. Not quite. He stood upright on a scaffold, neck craned for years, slowly becoming the world's most muscular chiropractor's dream. The myth came from early biographies that dramatized his suffering for the artist as martyr image. In truth, he was just miserable in a vertical position. So no, Michelangelo wasn't lying down serenely creating divine art. He was hunched, cranky, and probably muttering Italian curses about ceiling height. 35. We were all taught that medieval people believed diseases came from bad smells, right? Technically true, but not as dumb as it sounds. The miasma theory actually kind of worked, because bad smells often did mean bacteria or decay. It was a flawed hypothesis with accidental accuracy, like guessing the murderer because they had suspicious vibes. It took centuries to learn about germs, but medieval doctors were at least sniffing in the right direction. Sometimes history gets lucky by accident, kind of like finding science in a compost pile. 36. Here's a delicious one. Marco Polo didn't bring pasta to Italy from China. Italians had been eating noodles long before his travel blog went viral. What Marco Polo did bring back was exaggeration. His discoveries were mostly hearsay stitched together by ghostwriters. Historians now think large chunks of the travels of Marco Polo were made up, including unicorns, which were actually rhinos, and dog-headed men. The man basically invented medieval clickbait. He wasn't a liar. He was an influencer who'd never heard of fact-checking. 37. Then there's the myth that the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 gave everyone freedom and democracy. Cute, but no. It was a rich guy peace treaty between an angry king and even angrier barons. Regular peasants weren't invited. It didn't end tyranny, it just made it slightly more organized. The only freedom guaranteed to commoners was the right to stay poor with legal efficiency. But centuries later, historians rebranded it as the birth of liberty, proving that good PR can make even medieval tax documents sound noble. 38. Here's a personal favorite. The myth that ancient Romans vomited during feasts so they could eat more. The so-called vomitoriums weren't puke rooms, they were exit hallways in amphitheaters. The idea that senators were having tactical puking sessions mid-dinner is pure Victorian fantasy, invented by moralists who wanted to paint Rome as a land of gluttonous sin. In truth, they just ate too much and took naps. History didn't need to exaggerate. The empire was already collapsing under its own buffet. 39. Remember when teachers said the Black Death was spread by rats? Turns out, that's only half true. The main culprits were people, specifically their fleas and lice. New studies show human parasites spread the plague faster than rats ever could, meaning medieval hygiene, or the lack thereof, was the real villain. It's ironic. For centuries, we blamed the rats while ignoring that the true biological disaster was wearing the same tunic for a month. So yes, the rats were innocent. The humans were just gross. 40. And finally for this batch, no, the Mona Lisa's fame didn't come from her mysterious smile or Leonardo's genius. It came from theft. In 1911, an Italian handyman stole the painting from the Louvre, hid it for 2 years, and turned it into front-page news worldwide. Before that, she was just another portrait in a big museum. The real masterpiece wasn't Da Vinci's brushwork. It was the global marketing campaign triggered by panic. So the world's most famous artwork owes its popularity to one guy's 5-finger discount. Proof that in art, as in life, crime sometimes does pay, at least in publicity. 41. Let's start the final stretch with one of the most dramatic myths ever, that Spartans threw weak babies off cliffs. Sounds hardcore, right? Except historians found zero evidence it was actually a routine practice. It likely came from a single exaggerated story written by, you guessed it, their enemies. In reality, sick infants were often cared for or quietly abandoned, not yeeted into canyons. The legend survived because everyone loves the idea of Spartans as macho extremists. Turns out, even in ancient times, nothing sold better than toxic gym culture. 42. You know how people say Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity with that kite experiment? We already debunked that. But here's an encore myth, that he invented the light bulb. Nope. That was Thomas Edison, kind of. Edison didn't invent the light bulb either. He perfected it. Dozens of inventors had working prototypes before him. What Edison actually invented was marketing. He patented, mass-produced, and electrocuted a few elephants for demonstration purposes. No, really. So while Franklin was out nearly dying for science, Edison was turning it into a brand. America's first influencer wasn't on Instagram. He was in a lab, taking credit for other people's ideas. 43. And speaking of misunderstood geniuses, Galileo didn't prove the Earth revolves around the sun. He supported the idea with evidence, sure, but the math didn't fully work until Kepler came along with elliptical orbits. Galileo just yelled about it louder. The church didn't like being yelled at, so they turned it into the most famous "you're grounded" in history. The myth of Galileo, the lone rebel scientist, is poetic, but incomplete. He was half right, half wrong, and all attitude. Basically, the Renaissance's version of that guy who insists he's technically correct. 44. One of history's weirdest myths. Vikings were dirty, unwashed brutes. Archaeology disagrees. They were obsessed with grooming. Excavations found tweezers, razors, combs, even ear cleaners. They bathed weekly, which was basically five-star hygiene for the year 900. In fact, English monks complained that Viking men bathed so often they were stealing all the local women. So the scary berserkers of history were just buff, well-moisturized Scandinavians with great hair and commitment issues. 45. Let's debunk another legend, that medieval castles were gray stone fortresses of gloom. They weren't. They were painted, brightly. Many were covered in bold reds, yellows, and blues. Imagine a stone unicorn vomit rainbow. Centuries of weather washed it away, leaving us with the color palette of depression. So when you picture a brooding knight gazing from a gray battlement, remember, that wall was once hot pink. History wasn't drab, it was fabulously gaudy. 46. You've probably heard that Columbus proved the Earth was round. Wrong again, but we've already destroyed that myth. Here's the fun sequel. Columbus never actually set foot on what's now the United States. He landed in the Caribbean, thought it was Asia, and died believing he'd found India. That's why we call the locals Indians. His navigational mistake became a centuries-long branding error. If GPS existed back then, half of history would just be a rerouting message. 47. Let's talk about the myth that cowboys were all white, stoic gunslingers. Nope. About 1 in 4 cowboys were black, Mexican, or Native American. The rugged Lone Ranger image came from Hollywood's casting choices, not history. Real cowboys were multilingual, multicultural, and mostly tired. The Old West was less gritty adventure and more underpaid farm work with extra dust. The cowboy myth was America's first cinematic filter, polishing sweat, danger, and diversity right out of the picture. 48. And for the grand finale, the myth that people in the Middle Ages thought bathing caused disease. Quite the opposite. It was doctors in the 18th century who started spreading that nonsense. They believed water opened your pores and let illness sneak in. So when people got sick, they stopped bathing, which made them smell awful, which spread more sickness. A historical feedback loop of funk. It's the most ironic public health disaster ever. People literally died trying to stay clean. Humanity has made many mistakes, but few as pungent as that one. So there you have it, centuries of lies your history teacher probably graded you on. From Viking shampoo routines to royal marketing campaigns, it turns out the truth is always weirder, smellier, and significantly dumber than the myth. Which one deserves detention from history class? Drop your pick in the comments. And remember, the past may be behind us, but stupidity? That's timeless.